When the holidays start to feel a bit repetitive, reach for a Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry and put your twist on tradition. A bold cranberry and winter spice flavor fusion, Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry is a refreshing way to shake things up this sipping season. And only for a limited time. Sprite. Obey your thirst.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay, a holiday you're saving.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. This season, enjoy spacious, comfortable rooms and friendly service when you book with Hilton instead. Hilton for the stay.
Hello everybody and welcome to 3D Printing Basics. I just wanted to let you know that if you're interested in getting every single episode a week before its release and ad-free, then please head over to my Patreon. The link will be in the show notes, and like I said, you can get every single episode ad-free and a week before its initial release date. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you like this episode. Hello and welcome back to 3D Printing Basics. This is episode number 91, and in this week's episode, we are going to be diving into what exactly happens inside of the hot end. I know that we all know what the hot end is for, we all know what it's used for, we all know what it does, but I thought that I would break down the intricacies and just exactly what happens inside the hot end and what it does, because it actually is a lot more complex and difficult to execute than it sounds. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you everybody for listening. If you happen to like the podcast, feel free to follow it and to leave it a 5-star review. I would really appreciate it. But at the end of the day, thank you guys so much for listening, and let's jump right into today's episode. All right, so we all know the hot end. In case anybody doesn't have a 3D printer, the hot end is basically where the magic happens. That is where the filament or the plastic that you're using gets melted, and that's where it gets pushed out of the nozzle and gets laid down onto the build plate to start creating whatever it is that you are wanting to make. So without a hot end, there is no 3D printer. I like to think of the hot end as kind of the tip of the hot glue gun. Basically, I like to think of a 3D printer as one motorized hot glue gun. Just to make it simple, you have the solid material coming in through the top, and then it gets heated up and pushed out of the end of the hot glue gun. And this hot glue gun happens to be on a gantry that moves around and builds up layer by layer by layer until you have the part that you want. So the hot end is exactly what it sounds like. It's the hot end that makes the filament melt and exactly goes out where you want it. So that's the pretty simple job of the hot end, but like I said, it's a little bit harder than it sounds. So inside the hot end, the filament goes through 3 distinct zones. You have the cold zone, where it initially gets fed in. You have the transition zone, which is where it gets melted, and then the hot zone, where it stays melted and gets pushed out of the tiny little nozzle. So let's start with the cold zone. This is where most of your problems are going to happen with clogged filament, with any other kind of hot end issues. It's going to usually happen in the cold zone. And this is where filament is still fully solid. It has a very simple job. It's to keep filament rigid. It's to prevent it from softening too early so that you can have the correct feed rate. And it's also to provide resistance so the extruder can push properly. So if you have filament that is too soft or is getting melted too early, then it loses its rigidity and the extruder gears cannot push the filament out at the desired rate that it needs to be in order to print something properly. So the cold zone is really, really important, and it's usually cooled by a heat break and a dedicated hot end fan, not the part cooling fan. That is a separate thing. It is a dedicated hot end fan that keeps this area cold so that, like I said, the filament can remain in a rigid state and be pushed out at the correct feed rate. And if filament softens too early, like I said, it can't be pushed cleanly anymore, and that will lead to jams, grinding, clicking. It's called heat creep. That is what the problem is called. I did just learn that. If I knew that, I would have definitely been saying that this whole entire time. But like I said, even somebody as experienced in 3D printing as I am, you learn new things every day. So that's what I love about 3D printing. But yes, this overall problem where you have jams, grinding, clicking extruders, it's usually due to the filament softening too early, and then it can't be pushed cleanly anymore, and that is called heat creep. All right, so now that we've broken down the cold zone, let's jump right into the transition zone, which is arguably the most critical part of the hot end. And this is where the filament goes from solid to rubbery, soft, it's starting to melt a little bit, to completely molten. And this zone needs to be short, it needs to be very well controlled and very stable, because semi-molten filament behaves a lot like chewing gum. If the transition zone gets too long or too hot or too inconsistent, then the filament can expand, it can stick to the walls, it can jam, it can clog, and cause all kinds of problems. And this is why all metal hot ends are kind of the new wave. They're taking over compared to the PTFE lined hot ends. They are much easier to use because they have a much better and much more reliable transition zone. This is why retractions can also cause clogs, because if you bring something up into the transition zone and into the cold zone, then you have soft filament being in the cold zone, which we just described as not being good. And it can also cause printing, which is too hot, and it can actually make extrusion worse. If your transition zone is at too high of a temperature, you can melt the filament too quickly, which again leads to the problems that we talked about with the cold zone, where if it's too soft, it's not getting pushed out correctly. And then, like we said, the feed rate is off, and that causes all kinds of problems. It can cause under extrusion, over extrusion, the whole 9 yards. All right, so now that we've discussed the transition zone, it's time to get to the hot zone. And this is where filament must flow cleanly so that you have the correct feed rate, the correct flow rate, and everything comes out exactly as it should. And for the hot zone, the filament must be fully molten, it must be evenly heated, and it must be free flowing. There cannot be any clogs or anything like that that is holding up filament in the hot zone, because that will disrupt the flow rate. So inside the nozzle, the molten plastic is under pressure, and the reason it's under pressure is so that it can come out at a consistent rate. So think of the nozzle as squeezing toothpaste through a tiny hole. If anything disrupts this flow and prevents the toothpaste from coming out at the same rate, you're going to see, like I said, under extrusion, inconsistent lines, surface defects, or sudden clogs. Now, some common hot zone issues, they can include partial nozzle clogs, burnt filament buildup, which is filament that can stick to the nozzle and then just kind of burns and sticks there. You can have printing too cold, or you can have worn or damaged nozzles, which I actually just went over in a recent episode. I don't remember off the top of my head what number episode it was, but I do know it was recent because I just recorded it. So if you are looking to learn more about the nozzle of your 3D printer, I have a whole episode dedicated to that, so please feel free to check it out. But with that being said, that's all three zones. Yes, that is all three zones right there. You got the cold zone, the transition zone, and the hot zone. So now I wanted to continue on to why jams seem to come out of nowhere. And I know we've all been there before. We have a nice print on the bed. It's coming out really nicely. Nothing seems to be the problem. Sometimes we walk away. Sometimes we're watching it as it happens. And for me, it's usually when I walk away and I come back and there's a giant spaghetti nest or nothing coming out at all of the 3D printer. Something has gone terribly wrong and the print is completely failed. And it looks like there is a jam. And we're wondering, hey, this jam came out of nowhere. It seemed like everything was going really smoothly, really well. So I'm wondering why that jam came. And the reality is that most jams, they're not sudden. They build up slowly. You can have heat creep. You can have marginal cooling, which is cooling that isn't good enough. You can have some moist or wet filament. You can have too many retractions, printing too hot or too cold. And eventually, when these jams come, it's usually because the filament swells in the transition zone. It can stick to the heat rate, and then the extruder can't push anymore. And that's when you hear the clicking or the grinding, and that is because that is the extruder gears grinding against the filament and actually wearing it away, because it's trying to push the filament through, and obviously it's metal on plastic, and the filament is stuck. It's not going anywhere, and so what usually happens is, like sandpaper, those gears just grind away that plastic. And I've pulled out a lot of rolls of filament just to see the end of it have those classic kind of concave little areas where the extruder gears very clearly grinded on it, and that is the issue there. All right, now that we've discussed that, I wanted to discuss the retractions and the hot end a little bit more because that is very important when it comes to the hot end and can be one of the main reasons that you are having issues. So first off, in case you didn't know, a retraction is usually when you are jumping from either a part to part or from just point A to point B. The printer will lift up the nozzle and bring it over to point B, and then it will drop the nozzle and begin printing again. And when it does this, it retracts the molten filament upwards by a set amount, usually less than a millimeter, and that is supposed to help with stringing and making sure that the prints or that the molten nozzle, or excuse me, the molten filament doesn't leak out of the nozzle and cause strings across your parts. And it is really good at doing that, but if you have your retraction distance set too high, then you can have issues where hot filament enters the transition zone, the molten filament, and then it cools unevenly, sticks to the walls, and causes a clog. And this is why all metal hot ends need shorter retractions, and direct drive setups use shorter retractions, and more retraction is not always better. I tend to keep my retractions usually at 0.2 millimeters. That seems to be more than enough for me to make sure that there isn't a lot of stringing, and if there is a little bit of stringing, it's easily taken care of. And also making sure that the molten filament does not get brought up into the transition zone so you don't have any clogs. But at the end of the day, these are tests that you need to run. There are plenty of retraction tests out there that you can run for your printer so that you can find out what is working best for you. But retractions and the hot end go hand in hand, and it's very, very important that you have your retractions dialed in to make sure that you don't deal with any of those clogs. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is, we kind of touched on it a little bit, is the PTFE line versus all metal hot ends. And so the PTFE lined hot ends, they just have the PTFE tube in there, and that is what the filament usually rides down in the cold zone into the transition zone. And PTFE lined hot ends usually, they have lower friction, they're easier for PLA, but they have the limited max temperature because the PTFE will melt if you go above a certain temperature. So you can't use, for example, engineering filaments or some super high temperature filaments on the PTFE line hot ends because the PTFE tube will melt. And of course, the tube will degrade over time, so you will have to replace it eventually. Whereas all metal hot ends, they have a higher temperature capability. They're better for the high temperature filaments like nylon, ABS, ASA, and so on. They are more sensitive to retractions and are less forgiving with PLA. And I would say neither one is better than the other one. They each have their really good use cases. It's just a matter of understanding what they do and how they work for these hot ends, and so that you can adjust your print settings correctly and give yourself a better chance at having more successful prints and less clogs. Because the whole point of understanding a hot end and how it works is to ensure that you have the most or the best chance at success as possible so that you don't have any reprints. And that is the ultimate goal of 3D printing, is to minimize errors and print failures and maximize print successes. And with that being said, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode and were able to learn a little something about the hot end part of the 3D printer. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.